Manila Cave, Manila Mine, 1920, 24, about 4 years. There was some mining, 100 tons of ore came out. I don't know if there was any profit or not. I think lead, maybe tungsten or scheelite ore that has tungsten, things like that. So it's low grassland, which is more unusual to have so much grassland in public federal land, and mountain ranges that are partially or mostly owned by federal landscape. So in terms of landscape connectivity or corridors, this is an important area, particularly across the lowlands that we see, and that's the Baba Kamari Ranch or Brophy Ranch. This was a Mexican land grant along the stream back in the 1820s, and it's fairly intact, and a lot of the owners are conservation sensitive. So this landscape is an important one for corridors from Mexico on up to Tucson through the mountain ranges and grassland. We're on the foothills of the Huachuca Mountains. Manila Mine is, there's a vertical mine shaft that someone fell in and died under some suspicion. So the first effort to keep people out of mines and caves were about 1971-72. That was just focused to keep people out. We're now at our third iteration. The first two iterations were just to keep people out. First it was welding rebar and landing mat on top of things, completely unfriendly for bats or anything larger than that. The second one was a cave grate by cavers, but was pretty readily overwhelmed with hydraulics and welding and things like that. So it's an amazing effort it takes to make a gate that people cannot defeat it. Now, so we pulled all the dentures out of the mouths of the caves. Here, Hyatt Cave, about a third of a mile up, not too much higher in elevation, and there's along the skyline ridge, there's an upper Hyatt Cave, which is a kind of a collapse hole that is used by bats, and apparently leptos are using it a little more frequently this year than in the past. So we had records from the University of Arizona that Leptonicterus had been found in Hyatt Cave, and maybe this one in the 50s. It's good old bat field work and records. So we knew that was a cave that could be used by it. So we took the stuff out of the mouth with a lot of big air truck and pneumatic stuff, jackhammering rebar and cement and all that in the summer, got it out. Then we just put the fence around so there's no obstruction from anything flying out from the cave entrance or going in. That's why it's large enough on the sides to be to have the fence and the barbed wire well away from the entrance of the cave. And in this cave there's a couple of skylights where it looks like the mining it goes along a quartz vein, and you can walk in, but there are a couple of skylights. We left the landing mat in there, but we didn't. If animals were coming out there, we didn't want the fence close to that part, those entries also.
Okay. So we went inside this mine, and I found a dead lesser long-nosed bat in there. So that pretty well cemented it. Yeah, they used that site. So then they were interested then in surveying for the bats on the fort, and so we did do some external counts, internal surveys, and over that next year we saw about 50 lesser long-nosed bats in there. And then over the next 6 years the numbers varied from, they climbed up to 100 or so, then they pretty well leveled off at about 500 to 600 lesser long-nosed bats in there for a few weeks at a time in the summer. One time it ballooned, just one night it ballooned to 1,800, don't know why, maybe they got disturbed from someplace else, but, so roughly about 500 or 600 bats. Meanwhile, as Sheridan said, there was historical evidence from Pyatt, and I had been in Pyatt again before all of this came about, and done some work in Pyatt and actually found bone material of lesser long-nosed bats in Pyatt, so I knew that they had been using that as well. Now that bone material could have gone back to the days when Lendell Cockrum and Bobby Baker, from, if you know these biologists, had been to Pyatt for lesser long-nosed bats. They were actually collecting for genetics and whatnot. So we began then to do a more serious survey, and at that time the cave had been totally open. You could see spray paint on the walls, on the exterior. One of the shots I showed in the talk yesterday were some spray paint as somebody was walking down into a site. That was Pyatt Cave, and so it had been heavily used and disturbed just by recreational cavers. So over the course of the 7 years when lesser long-nosed bats were not in Pyatt, they were using manila. Then they changed over. A couple of reasons why that might have been: there were some researchers who came to do some work here. They may have disturbed them. They did get them from Manila. Who knows, maybe that prompted them to not like Manila as much. Worked to their benefit and ours because they rediscovered Pyatt. And so in that first year we had about 30 bats in Pyatt, and over the next few years the numbers started to climb, and then you saw the numbers. Last year we were up somewhere in the realm of about 25,000 in Pyatt. Manila subsequently is really only used now as a night roost, and so at nighttime, if you approach the site, you can hear the bats flying around you. They're just checking you out. They have very loud wing noises compared to other bats. They also smell very sweet when they're flying around you, so you can pretty well tell you've got them around you. And they're just going in and out of that particular mine. It's a nice little mine in terms of safety, easy for people to go in and out of. Kids, could cave relatively safely in there. So in a way, it's kind of a shame that it's been closed off, but obviously the bats need it more than recreational cavers do. It is still possible to use these caves, however, just by going and getting permission at the MP office and going through the hoops for safe caving. So people do get to go in.
There's a moratorium for a couple of years following up. Well, at the end I'll talk about recreational caving. Right now, no recreation caving is allowed on Fort Huachuca. No one knows, no one will admit making a decision, but that's Army politics, not caving politics. But for that, about half the year when bats were not detected here, we'd open recreational caving. People could go to the MPs, show their safety gear, get a key, and go in the cave. And that provided more locations and names of caves, more cleanup and rehabilitation of caves, some paleontological work. So some of the cavers were pretty dedicated for caves, bats, things like that. So we have a good working relationship, which is strained or broken for now. Go ahead.
Okay. So since then, the sorts of things we've done are external counts mostly. Once the bats are gone, we do go inside to check around for bone material or fecal splatter. The nectar-feeding bats, if you're unaware, have a pretty characteristic fecal splatter. It's a yellow, looks like little yellow paint splatters. Hello? This is because they're eating essentially nectar and pollen. So it's actually their poop. It's not urine. It's fecal splatter is sort of the cute name people are using. So when you have these animals in a place, you know you've got nectar bats. Now, because we have two species of nectar bats, you can't be sure which species it is. But because Chironectarus, the Mexican long-tongued bats, really only occur in numbers somewhere between about 1 to 50 at most in a site, versus lesser long-nosed bat, you've got thousands of them. If you've got a lot of splatter, you can pretty well assume that it's lesser long-nosed bats. The other thing we do in the wintertime is go in and remove data loggers. So when the bats are not present, we put in data loggers. We do anything else that needs to be done, check to see that there isn't something damaging that's been done in the cave, somebody's breached the system or something. We do look for breaches in the system on almost every visit that we make to one of the openings to do an external count. And there usually are not breaches to the system by people. Lots of wildlife still use the sites. So we have data loggers in any of the caves on the post that have bats in them. We have eye buttons in place. And I would suggest that for those of you getting started, if you have caves or mine tunnels, I would recommend the very first two things you do is go to your sites, and if it's a time of year when there could be bats inside, and that's different in different places depending on your elevation, the temperature of the site, the kind of habitat you're in. But if it's summer, you can generally figure if there's bats, they're probably in one of your sites, unless your sites are cold sites and therefore winter sites. But if you don't know anything about it, you could go visit these sites, sit at the exterior at dusk, and be patient, sit there prepared to wait for an hour and a half, and find out if bats come out. That would be your first clue. The other thing you can do is, once you know there are not bats inside, so you do that however many times you need to do to find out when bats aren't there. And if they're using it as a summer type roost, probably the temperature is not going to be correct as a winter roost. And so, you know, as fall approaches, again, depending on where you are in the country, you can begin to assume, okay, probably not there. Go and do an external wait to see if they are. If they're not, you can now begin to think, okay, no bats inside. And you could go to the interior and put in some loggers. And eye buttons, if you don't know about eye buttons, they're very cheap. They're easy to use. They're only the size of maybe a dime or two tied together. And you can get them to record temperature and humidity. And easy to place around in cracks and crevices or hang from formations. You can get your first step towards white nose surveillance, because white nose has very particular characteristics, both temperature and humidity wise. When I say white nose, I mean the Geomyces fungus has very particular requirements that it needs
How far
to grow.
back then would you suggest putting?
I would recommend, if you've got the money, that you put them all throughout, because bats are going to pick microclimates within a cave. A cave is not one temperature, a cave is many, many temperatures.
What if you have no money?
If you have no money, then you're going to have to invest in a couple, and then I would say midway and at the back as a
Okay.
start, and see what kind of temperatures you're getting. You might also look into, I'm not always in favor of pulling in grottos and things. Sheridan's much more open to that than I am. I'm a little more protective of a site, but you know, if you get the local grottos, the cavers, on your side, then you've got an extra workforce, and by letting them help you, you often make them happy, and then they're less inclined to do vandalism. So you might try local people, see if any of them want to put up the money for an eye button, or for helping with work that needs to be done. And then I would say getting loggers inside a cave is a really good first step, because you'll find out if you have the conditions for white nose. Now, since I'm presuming you're all not just interested in white nose, but in bats in general on any of your compounds, then of course getting temperatures can help you to determine what sorts of species would be using that cave, and the time of year that bats are going to use those caves. Is it an appropriate temperature as a maternity roost? In other words, pretty high temperatures. And those are going to differ for different species, but somewhere in the realm of 70 degrees to 100 degrees would be maternity roost requirements. Karchner Caverns that we passed on the way down, it's only 70 degrees inside that cave, but that is a maternity roost for Myotis velifer. It's also very humid, so getting those relative humidity readings as well as temperature is important and will be informative as to what you can get. I should have started this by saying, you know, there's literature. There's both academic literature and then tech reports. People came before all of you to your compounds. It's very possible, especially if you're near a university, that somebody at the university has been there and already surveyed your area. And you just aren't seeing it because those things sit on somebody's desk and get carried away when they leave. So there may be tech reports available for some of your compounds. And I would say try and find that information first and then use it. Or if you find out just in records, Joe Schmo biologist was here. Look up Joe Schmo. You know, you got Google. Go for it. See if Joe Schmo still has old records from when he was on the post and, you know, found out the information. So all of that is stuff you can do really without disturbing bats. Ultimately, there'll have to be a little bit of disturbance in find out for sure what species you have, whether you net externally, or whether, you know, the site for some reason, and I'm not a big proponent of swinging nets inside a cave, but if it were necessary because you couldn't find out another means, you might have to do something like that. Certainly as military compounds, I would imagine you've got access, if you can get it, to night vision equipment. So you might try and do that so that watching an external flight, you get more information than just sitting there and hopefully watching a bat fly past you. For the very initial stuff, it can be as simple as you sitting there and just watching, though. That's just plus or minus, are there bats here or not? And of course you have to do that multiple times throughout the year if you don't know the circumstances already.
Ronnie, what's the cost on those eye buttons, do you know? 'Cause they're not that expensive.
No,
are they?
they're around $100
Yeah.
a piece, and if you order in, I think, 10 or more, the price drops down to maybe 80 or
Yeah,
maybe
that's what I
85 or
thought.
something. Yeah, the temperature ones alone are cheaper than the temperature humidity, but you know, if you're gonna do it, it's
Right.
maybe an extra $20 for both those characteristics. So yeah, it's worth getting, because humidity is just as important. I mean, bats are using caves because they want to do thermal economy, but they also have water balance issues. So, you know,
The thing you guys need to think about too, though, is every installation has different requirements with their IT people. Sometimes it's very difficult to get approval to use even simple software like data loggers. So you need to check with your IT folks first and make sure that you have the appropriate ability to actually use the software once you get it.
Yeah, and I was going to suggest too that, I mean, going the data logger route's perfectly fine, but if you have a limited funding situation and you're going to be going into the thing anyways, you can get a pretty, you know, quick and dirty temperature and humidity profile by using handheld thermometers, either a Kestrel or an IR thermometer, things that are relatively low priced. You can use that to key in on the spots where the bats are roosting, because if it's a summer roost, they're often going to be leaving roost stain. Where the guano piles are located, it's, you know, simple physics to look straight up from that, and that's where your bats are going to be hanging out. And so you can get kind of a pre-survey profile of how the bats are utilizing that site without going ahead and investing a bunch of money into data loggers that are definitely appropriate for a long-term temperature and humidity mapping and characterization of your site. But if you do have limited funding, that's definitely a good solid way to do it as well, and then you don't run into the limitations of software and other things like that. So.
yeah, that's a great point. And obviously looking for guano in the interior. But again, you don't need to go into a site if bats are in there. You can wait for a period of time when the bats are not in there. You can then spend lots of time. You can use white lights so you can see extremely well inside. Look for where the guano is. You could even try and do rough sketches so that you can determine where the guano is now and whether the guano shifts around in there. You know, have the bats move to alternate locations inside the site. But yeah, that's essentially free to do something like that.
We did all this for one species, an endangered. We're presumably benefiting other species. So if we're going to do any change, vegetation and things like that, I think we would look at the literature and talk to biologists about all the species that may be in here and make sure we're not focusing too much on a single species. And then make the decision, even if we claiming it's a benefit for the lepidopterus.
One of the reasons for the fencing, it was the cheap bat gate before the surveillance went into place. And fences such as this one, especially with barbed wire on the top, you have to sort of think about the problems of barbed wire. Could bats get caught on the barbed wire? We've had barbed wire on these for a long time, and I will tell you, the mortality, at least that I've seen, has been 200% higher on agaves, getting caught on agaves, than it is on the barbed wire on the fences. That's not to say that barbed wire isn't an issue, just I haven't visually seen that sort of an issue. However, bats can come out of both of our sites that we have, 3 of our sites that we have fenced, and not have to worry about the structures of a gate. They can come out through the space that's been left and get up over these fences. Gates are not always accepted by all species of bats. So putting gates up, whereas gates are and nowadays they're being done with all kinds of considerations, you know, what's the laminar flow going through, the particular diameter of the bars of the gate, all those are things taken into consideration. The spacing, a child's head can't fit through it, but a bat can fit through it in flight. Those are all the sorts of things you have to look at with gates. And will a bat accept it? And many species of bats will not accept it. Right now we're in the process of testing whether lesser long-nosed bats will use a good bat gate. Coronado National Memorial has a colony of, in the last 10 years, the colony was in the realm of 10 to 20,000 lesser long-nosed bats. And they've put up gates and a cupola, and they are now continuing to do counts there to see how the bats have been affected by the gate, or if the bats will accept the gate. The jury is still out on that one. In any case, at the sites we've got here, lesser long-nosed bats may or may not like gates. The gate that was removed was probably part of the reason lesser long-nosed bats were not using Piot Cave. But that gate was taken out at the same time Sheridan said the work was done around here and the fences were put up. It still took 7 years for them to get back in there, so it had to be a combination of factors going on. For this particular site, Sheridan mentioned multiple species. We have 4 species that we know of that use, 5 species that we know of that use this mine. We have a maternity colony of Anthrozoas in here, pallid bats. We used to have a considerable number of Myotis vellifer, but once we opened up Piot again and protected Piot, part of the jump in increase we saw in Piot of Myotis vellifer were the ones coming from this over to that. Temperatures in this site are all over the place. They're just up and down. Humidity, up and down. So it isn't a stable, nice route. They used it because they weren't happy with Piot, with all the visitation, the gate, and whatever else. But when they were given a choice of Piot Cave, big, nice, open limestone cave, to this little mine tunnel, most of them have left and gone to Piot Cave. That's not true of the Anthrozoas. The Anthrozoas likes this sort of an open structure with crevices they can get into inside. We also have Mexican longtongues in this particular site, and we also have Corionorinus, the Townsend's big-eared bats. So it's a little non-complicated structure, but it provides a variety of crevices and surfaces for these animals to use for periods of time in the summer. So again, any other considerations you make have to take all of those species into your thought processes. The vegetation right now, Glenn made an excellent point, given fires, big fires in Arizona just ending about a month ago, and Glenn was certainly aware of all those fires being part of those teams. But right now, this vegetation is helping to sort of hide some of the fence work that's here to protect the bats. That may be a moot point in this case because Manila Mine is on any topo map you go to. So if anybody wants to go here, I mean, they could find the information. So it may be that it would be a good idea to thin out the vegetation here. And that certainly was a consideration when the fires were going on. Fort Huachuca has a pretty active fire control plan in place, and when the Huachucas were burning, Fort Huachuca did not burn. And so some of their previous fire planning was obviously part of that. The concept of modifying a structure as an artificial roost, we haven't considered here, but certainly we have. I mean, I've been aware that, you know, possibilities of doing it other places in southern Arizona, and it's a great idea. This one, because I just named off several species, I'm not sure we would want to mess with it and possibly change that. But yeah, it is a possible consideration. There are also some places where there's some underground building structures. You know, some of those possibly could be modified in some way.
There have been a number of success stories in modifying underground mines and other underground bunkers and underground buildings that may have thermally stable characteristics that you could modify the airflow or the light or different things like that that have attracted bats and numerous installations in several parts of the country, just so you're aware of it.
Stupid question. If you do something like that, how do you do the bats find it and reject it or accept it, or how do you get the bats to find it?
In the places that I'm aware of that have been the most successful, they've had maybe 1 or 2 bats using the structure, or they've had colonies nearby, and by improving the conditions, they've increased those numbers or attracted them from some other structure that was about to be torn down, or some kind of other mitigation for a place where you didn't want the bats to be roosting. I don't know of any structures that have been modified that have just attracted bats out of thin air, but I'm sure that's possible if you did it right and if you had high numbers of bats and high densities nearby. Does anybody else?
Yeah, no, I don't know of any.
We did bunker modifications in Puerto Rico, and with the baseline study, came back 2 years later and had then a double count when we rechecked.
Was that in a building or?
No, they were magazine bunkers left over from the Navy.
Okay.
What were the modifications that you made? Did you put like bat gates on the?
No,
on the
no, we
doors,
just
or-
increased the surface area
Oh, okay.
along the top.
And then kept the doors open, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of traffic there.
Yeah.
Bats are so structurally oriented, so curious that, you know, they're checking stuff out all the time. And so if they check something out and they don't get disturbed from it for a night, if they're night roosting there, then they'll say, hey, you know, this is the right temperature, this is the right humidity, this is great, I'm gonna stay here for a while. But they're,
We recently found a maternity colony in the gantry of a rocket or a missile launch pad out at White Sands, and so it'll show up in a lot of different places, and that's this big open, kind of exposed framework. And there they are. So keep it in mind, they are flexible.
And particularly structures that are underground or structures that are made of concrete and have high thermal stability, I think, are the structures to focus on your installation if you're interested in something like that. And you could probably contact any of the speakers from the workshop this week or BCI, and we could put you in touch with somebody that could help you with the details of that.
I will speak from experience. Working with reinforced concrete is not fun.
Two other places come to mind that you should be looking for on your installations. One is abandoned buildings. Bats will frequently use abandoned buildings. Abandoned meaning they're essentially closed. People aren't generally using them. But there has to be an opening, oftentimes at least two openings, which tend to be broken windows, broken doors, so that bats can get in and out of them. If nothing else, they tend to be good night roosts for many species. And the second thing I would suggest that you might want to look for on your installation are bridges. Bats will use bridges or culverts. If they have expansion joints in them, all the better. But sometimes just a culvert style bridge could become a hanging place for bats. Culverts generally more for night roosting, but bridges with expansion joints such as we saw last night, those become full-time daytime roosts and even maternity sites.
When you do bat management, it's a long-term process that you're committing to, so don't do something that you don't want to continue to do upkeep on, because what you don't want to do is do something positive and then 5 years from now it become a negative, a liability. So always keep that long time frame, because this is, you know, these roost modifications, all that stuff is a long-term promise, basically. And the other thing, just go along with the buildings things that Ryan just talked about, is DoD has the largest number of buildings in the federal government. Lots of them are used by bats. As Scott didn't really make this point, but I like to make it. We have additional species listed. You're going to have bats, endangered bats in buildings, which is going to be an absolute nightmare. Because one, Fish and Wildlife is not going to have any clue how to handle it, except that's their roost site, that's their cave, put a fence around it, and leave it. So you have to be thinking about that. Find out where your bats are roosting. You know, do what you can to make sure those sites are permanent, not being destroyed. You know, Chris's maternity colony was in a building initially, that mansion, and now Little Browns are actually a year away from listing. If they would not have been moved to that bat box, it would have been a huge nightmare.
And the other thing too, like, you know, it's going to be different in each state and on each installation in terms of pest control. But if you guys do have a pest control office separate from the natural resources office, get to know your pest control officers, because they're a great resource to find out where bats are at. A lot of times they don't have a clue that there's an issue with bats other than that they're tasked to remove them. And in the state of New York, it's perfectly legal for a pest control officer throughout the state to go kill an entire colony of Little Browns right now. So, you know, there's potential issues with that, but get to know your pest control officers, bring them into the loop, explain them what's going on, and you know, it's a good resource to follow up with.
And getting information on when the bats are in your buildings, what species are present, is going to allow you to say, okay, this species is looking for a home, and that's when you start thinking about potentially modifying habitat, you know, creating something to let that species move in someplace else.
Is
You
there
know,
any
sometimes
rule,
buildings are just good places anyway, but
is there any rule of thumb as far as uninhabited or abandoned structures, before you start, you know, before they get on your radar to start checking? There's a lot of demoing going on at, Port Irwin, and,
What is it you're talking about? Denver?
buildings, structures.
demolition.
You have a lot of old
Yeah,
World War.
taking down of a lot of buildings, right?
Are you dealing with old World War II wood?
Well, that's what I'm asking, I guess. There's some things that have only been in place maybe 10, 12, or up to 20 years, and other things have been there longer. Is there any, like, if a building's only been there for 10, 12 years, sitting there vacant, is that something can you not worry about that, or do you wanna?
No, I think it's a possibility, but I think it's less likely than older stuff.
Older being like over 20 years sitting vacant, would you say?
Yeah.
I would say
It really
that
does depend on the species.
yeah, it's going to depend on the structure itself too.
Okay.
If there's no space that these bats are able to actually roost in, that's probably a bigger issue than the age of the building itself. And how we deal with that a lot too. On Fort Drum, we have hundreds of World War II wood that we're demoing. We've been demoing for years. You know, we deal with Indiana bat. That's our endangered bat on the property. They're not known to use structures that often. They do use structures. So we've kind of dealt with that demoing is allowed. However, basically the first time you find a bat, everything ceases. And you go in and assess the situation and deal with it accordingly. But case by case is how we deal with it. We allow it to happen, and we just kind of monitor it periodically, and then if they do encounter a bat, they need to stop. So
I would suggest in those cases, you could look, the bats are probably not going to be in those buildings for long periods. I would suggest looking for guano in those buildings.
that's usually how we would check. You know, our attic spaces is where our primary roosting was going on, and the problem you run into, you know, we're literally talking 400 or 500 buildings that are coming down. There's no feasible way that you can schedule to get in
Right.
to look at all these, and so you have to rely somewhat on the contractors doing the work to actually follow the laws that you're working on the property. That's true with any of the construction that's going on your property in general. Those contractors are required to follow the laws and regulations that are on your installations, and if they're not doing that, they can get some pretty serious repercussions of that. So it's tough to kind of have that trust in some ways, but
Yeah, I don't
the-
know how many contractors are at that level are going to be aware enough to look for guano and stuff like that. So,
yeah, it's an education thing. We have in all of our contracts, we have language addressing bats. You know, that's a good way to get that information out. You know, if you have a requirement, if you're dealing with an endangered species that potentially could use a building, start putting it in your contracts to say, if you find a bat in the building, you know, you need to do this. And a lot of times what you need to worry about is typically your contracting representative is who you need to be working with to try and make sure that language is in there, and ensuring that, you know, this subcontractor that's subcontracting another subcontractor knows the requirements. And those are things that you kind of learn as you go, but once you start dealing with the con reps, that's where you're going to get the best bang for your buck.
okay, thanks.
I should be
So these plants reproduce on average between 10 to 20 years of age. They'll put up a flower stalk like that. The flower stalk takes 2 to 2.5 months to continue blooming. You got mammals that remember that and will keep coming back to feed.